Hi everybody, welcome to chapter 11, which is about industry and manufacturing. This is a really short chapter. I kind of just skim over it. So I just want you to take away the big picture ideas here, but it's going to be a pretty short chapter for you. I can make my mouse work. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to talk about in this chapter really mostly is why are all my shirts and your shirts probably made in less developed countries far away from home. And there are a lot of factors that go into this. Kind of the most common one that we think of is cheap labor. It's not just about cheap labor. It's about a variety of other things as well. So it's globalization and trade and where things are located, what type of regulations you have, where raw materials are located, do you have a port to get the stuff out? And so we're also going to talk about secondary industries. Those are industries, these manufacturing industries that are assembling and refining or putting things together. Right, so we're not talking about agriculture here. We're talking about making stuff or assembling stuff. It exists in all countries. We still have manufacturing in the United States. Some of it is for local consumption. Some of it is for export. And so there are countries that make and export a lot more goods than other ones do. Right now in the news a lot, our president is upset that we have a trade deficit with China, which means that we import more stuff to China than we export to China. But our economy is mostly a service economy now, or has centered a lot around a service economy. So a lot of the stuff that we are exporting is things like technology or banking or finance, or things that aren't kind of caught up in these manufacturing sectors. They are concentrated in some places more than others. They are concentrated in medium developing countries, right? So again, not the poorest countries of the world, but those that are kind of in the middle. Lots in India and China. And certain products are more likely from certain places, and a lot of this has to do with site and situation, which I've talked a lot about before, but basically where it is located and what are the resources that they have there available to them. And I just want us to talk about for a second that manufacturing is always done for a profit, right? Manufacturers are trying to make money. They are trying to have the most profit. They are trying to make their shareholders happy. There are some new kind of corporate sustainability models where places like Patagonia are trying to not have a zero growth model where they're not trying to get any bigger, but those are pretty few and far between, but they are still plenty profitable. Manufacturers use geography to maximize those profits. And so the geography of manufacturing is always changing based upon that site and situation. And I'm going to break those two down in a minute as well. But if you look at a company like Samsung, it has factories in 70 countries, right? Multinational corporations that are taking advantage of optimal site and situation. Companies are really good at this. And generally speaking, these governments want these companies to come in because they would like the jobs. They have $150 billion a year in annual revenue, and they maximize that revenue by strategic factory location. So what are some of the situation factors that I talked about? Choice one is being close to inputs. It is best if the cost of shipping raw materials is higher. Another example of this, this is called bulk reducing, right? So if you're going to manufacture steel, right, that is a bulk reducing opportunity. It is more expensive to ship the raw materials to go into steel around the world and process it somewhere else, right? So we want to be closer to those inputs. Choice two is close to markets, which is best if the cost of shipping a finished product is higher, right? That's called bulk gaining. This is often done with perishable goods. So we look at potato chips, which are a food, but done basically in a factory. Potato chips are perishable. not for quite a while, but they are perishable. And so we want to have them as close to ports as possible to get out. It is less important for us to have them right next to the potato farm necessarily. And so we can think about this in terms of beer as well. Beer is produced on a small scale everywhere, craft beer, right? Especially now, pretty much every state in the country has got some type of craft brewery. San Diego is certainly known for it. But most beer, that cheap yellow beer, that Coors and Bud, is produced near population centers because it is expensive to ship beer around. It is less expensive to ship the barley that goes into it than the weight of the actual alcohol. Situations change, though. They don't stay the same all the time. When you look at your imports, new sources of raw material can be exploited in other countries. And you might have overexploited a resource in one country. An example is steel in the US. We certainly still manufacture steel, and that has been in the news a lot lately. But there's also Chinese steel available. And so that steel is cheaper, generally, not all the time, than American steel. So that situation has changed. And then also new markets emerge. And so, for an example, is a car here. More new demand in medium developing countries, for example, China and India, right? So now China and India are manufacturing more cars because they have more people there who are buying these cars. And also, depending on free trade and globalization and trade routes, is going to depend on where you are going to want to have the manufacturing located. And then when we look at site factors, we look at things like labor costs and the size of the labor pool. This changes very, very rapidly. Capital investment, land, is there adequate space? Is there adequate infrastructure, power, transit, ports? Oops, excuse me. So if you look at Silicon Valley, where you have Google and Facebook and eBay and a bunch of other companies all living there, right? There's a lot of money in Silicon Valley. The labor is there. A lot of, it's an attractive place for some very well-educated tech people to live. And, relatively close to San Francisco in that valley, there was land available to do it. But often things switch kind of based upon when you talk about, labor and costs, right? If we look at this hourly wage chart, it is much more expensive to employ somebody in the United States versus China or India. And so that has caused a lot of manufacturing. That is part of what has caused a lot of manufacturing to go overseas, is that we can pay a lower hourly wage overseas, and then that product is cheaper and that profit margin is much higher. So when we think about auto manufacturing in the US, we'll talk more about that, how that has changed over the years. And when we look at site and situation together, when Honda was looking for where they were going to put their new assembly plant, which they put one in Greensburg, there in the center of the map, they want to know where. They want it to be near car buyers. So in the United States, it's a good idea. Lots of car buyers in the United States. You want it to be near inputs or the factories that are making the parts, which it was. You need a big piece of land available in Greensburg. You need it to be near transit lines, which it also is. And you want less labor competition. So if you look at these labor markets surrounding these other car makers' assembly plants, right, Greensburg kind of carves right out this spot. It's not really overlapping. So there's less labor competition. You're less likely to have your employee come to you and say, like, hey, I can go make more money at the manufacturer down the street, so you need to pay me more. And then also just generally cheaper costs, right? If you think about how much people make in San Francisco or in Southern California versus the Midwest, cheaper labor costs. This is really hard to see, but this is from an old Nissan that I used to own, a 98 Nissan, which was made there in Tennessee, and this is 3 stars from the Tennessee state flag. But this is a Japanese car company manufacturing cars in the United States. And these assembly chains are very complicated now. So you might have a Japanese company who is parts are being made all over the world, being shipped to certain places where the cars are being assembled. And this often happens on the US-Mexican border as well. So your car is kind of made in a lot of different places, not necessarily just in one place anymore. We also have the example of maquiladoras in Mexico, which are very, very close to us. These are export-oriented factories. So you can see here on the picture, the satellite photo right here. Here's the United States. It's a pretty unpopulated area right here. Here is these factories, these maquiladoras. And so these factories were set up right here because it is close to the US market. So you can manufacture goods right here, get them immediately across the border. The parts and the raw materials are shipped for cheap. To North Mexico, that's not New Mexico, to northern Mexico, and they're assembled in factories along the border, and then they're exported into the US to cut down on transportation costs. Again, shipping entire cars gets expensive. And also NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we have threatened to pull out of a couple times and are in the process of renegotiating, I believe, made that possible. These factories and these jobs in Mexico, right, we gained cheaper cars, and we also gained people to buy some of the parts that we were making in the United States, and then we got this labor market directly south of the border to us. But then we talk about deindustrialization, which is what has hit the middle of the United States a lot, which is what the last election was about a lot as well. But you have areas, what happens when industrial jobs leave? Sometimes they are replaced by other sectors, and sometimes they're replaced by nothing. This is this area, this heavy manufacturing area, in Europe, and it's an Iron Lady, Rust in Peace, right, in Belfast. These places take heavy economic hits when these manufacturing jobs leave. I'm from Connecticut. There was a lot of manufacturing jobs in Connecticut at one point. General Electric, when they used to really make stuff, was there. And, in my father's generation and my grandfather's generation, it was pretty common to go work in a factory, work at that factory for your entire life, get good benefits, make a really good wage. And that has changed. And so there's been a lot of parts of the country that have been kind of left behind by this transition. Right, so when we look at places like the Rust Belt, which is that yellow area on the map, there the blue is coal mining area. These are the areas that I'm talking about. You have the Northeast and Midwestern industrial areas didn't really adapt to the changing economy. Connecticut is not included in this, but we could be a little bit. Massachusetts and stuff recovered from that. Jobs have shifted to the suburbs and to the south and to overseas. So if you look at the city of Detroit, which you can see an abandoned auto factory there, right, in 1950 they had a population of 1.85 million. Detroit is a beautiful, booming city, and slowly, as that manufacturing has left, now we're down to 681,000, right? So you have this shrinking city and this lack of investment because this manufacturing has left. And now a lot of places are trying to get new businesses to come in there. Places like, where is Amazon going to build their new distribution center, right? So not about making the thing, but getting a place that has to do with distribution because you're closer to markets. That is the end of this chapter. I told you I would try to keep it short.